I really appreciate seeing everyone here at this event. This is a Latin America Center event. And we have two special guests, and I'm gonna conscript Oliver Kaplan at some point today also to play a part. He was an inaugural director of the Latin America Center and continues to do great work on Latin America, so we can't pass up the chance to have him participate fully. Thanks, of course, to Mandy for organizing today and getting everything in place, and Ella and oh, there you are, and Kobe who've been helping out too. There are staff at the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies, which is the umbrella over our regional centers, Latin America, Africa, Middle East. We work closely with the China Center and the Center for Immigration Policy Research. So there's a lot of events and curricular input that our regional centers offer, research papers. You can see the papers that our scholars are writing. We bring visiting scholars to spend time here at Corbell. We have people like Arturo signed up as a community scholar, just to be part of our network and occasionally present here, but to be part of our universe. So these centers are an important part of our relation with the community and with different regions and with the students. So it's really nice to see students here today. I'm Aaron Schneider. I'm the director of the Latin America Center at the moment and of the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies. And we're here to talk about Trump 2.0 and Latin America. And I think anything that we say about Trump 2.0 changes by the day and week, so we'll see where things stand at the moment. But we have two people who've been watching U.S. Latin America affairs for a very long time and can place what's happening now in that context. So I'll say a few words about Arturo, Dr. Lopez-Levy, and Dr. Rodriguez Francisco. Dr. Lopez-Levy is a political scientist and an economist, specializing in international politics, international political economy, comparative politics, and economic development. His research agenda focuses on Cuba, Latin American politics and markets, and the U.S. role in world affairs. I'll mention, and I hope that he'll elaborate on it, either in the questions or in his presentation, that he's done some really interesting work, including his dissertation, his PhD thesis here at Corbell, reframing U.S.-Cuban relations, thinking of them in terms of a concept that he came up with that I really appreciate, hegemony for recognition. Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on that, and especially where your thinking on that issue might be these days, given changes over the last decade since you finished your thesis. Arturo has taught more than 50 semester-length courses in prestigious colleges and universities. He's currently faculty at Georgia College and State University, and he's been assistant professor of politics and IR at Holy Names, at the UT Rio Grande, at Gustavus Adolphus College, where he was Bruce Gray postdoc, and he's been a Fulbright professor of international relations at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Francisco Rodriguez is a Venezuelan economist with decades of experience in public service, academia, and the private sector. He is currently the Rice Professor of Practice at Corbell, and prior to joining Corbell, he taught economics and public policy at the University of Maryland, at Wesleyan, at the University of Notre Dame. He has held prominent positions in the public and private sector, including head of the Economic and Financial Advisory of the Venezuelan National Assembly, head of research of the research team at the UN Human Development Report Office, and chief Andean economist of Bank of America. His most recent book is entitled Scorched Earth, The Political Economy of Venezuela's Collapse, in which he argues, and hopefully he'll elaborate a little bit on this topic and on this argument. He argues that in highly polarized societies, political actors are more likely to adopt scorched earth policies that generate negative effects on the economy in their struggle for power, turning the economy into a political battleground. So we suggested to our guests that they present for 8 to 10 minutes some of their top observations on what's happening in terms of Trump and Latin America and Latin America more generally. And then I'll pose a few questions and we'll make sure that there's time for everyone in the audience to collaborate and ask questions too. There's a microphone, I think, next to you.
Yep. You can also use this one here. Francisco, you grab the mic. Why don't you go ahead and get started?
Okay, sure. Well, thanks a lot, Aaron. And it's a pleasure to be here with Arturo and with all of you to have this opportunity to talk about events that are changing. I mean, you said by the day, it's almost like by the nanosecond. It's really actually quite amazing, for example, to see how financial markets can go from being deep in the red to being high in the green to then being in the red again. And all of this because of not even of statements anymore, but because of changes in how markets interpret what the administration is trying to do. And this is something that, interestingly, people like me who study countries like Venezuela were very used to this type of volatility. There's almost a sense in which the past few days have brought a recollection of a moment in 2007 where President Hugo Chavez declared that he would withdraw Venezuela from the International Monetary Fund. Well, it turns out that all Venezuelan external debt contracts had a clause in them that indicated that withdrawal from the International Monetary Fund, ceasing membership in the International Monetary Fund or in the World Bank, were considered a default event. So that effectively, when Chavez declared that he was withdrawing Venezuela from the IMF, he was declaring that he would default on the nation's debt. And indeed, obviously, there was a crisis in Venezuelan debt markets when that occurred. And then a few days later, government spokespersons announced that that would no longer be happening, that was under revision, and it never got done. So Venezuela did not create a default event under Chavez for its debt. So the government backtracked on that, but it caused this huge market volatility. And there's other this is just one incident, but I could mention many others in which I've seen, both during my experience and in my research, governments in developing countries and governments usually led by leaders who have a similar orientation to that of Mr. Chavez and Mr. Trump, who come from different ideological spheres, but I think actually have a lot of commonalities. And something that you see a lot of times is that these are governments that take actions that are hard to understand from the logic of just the analysis of economic policy. And for example, Hugo Chavez declared in 2003, he imposed exchange controls in Venezuela. Those exchange controls were in place for 15 years up until 2018. And they are actually, to some extent, still in place. But in 2018, there was a significant easing of them. So now, what was the role of these exchange controls? Exchange controls are often taken as policies to try to restrict demand for foreign exchange. Well, the reality of what was happening underneath is that President Chavez obtained the capacity to decide which firms received foreign exchange in the economy. And this gave him an incredible political lever, which is, if you are not on good terms with the government, you do not get foreign exchange. And if you do not get foreign exchange in a country like Venezuela, you're in the private sector, may as well be out of business. So it was, at the time, many of us economists were trying to understand the policy, and we thought that it would be short-lived because we didn't think that it made economic sense for this policy to be continued over time. But the fact is that it didn't have to make economic sense, it made political sense. So to go back to Mr. Trump, what have we seen in the past few weeks, days? We've seen several remarkable turnarounds in tariff policy, from essentially an announcement that wide-ranging tariffs were going to be imposed on the rest of the world, and almost a simultaneous declaration of a trade war with the rest of the world, to then a pause in those tariffs with the exception of China, then to the announcement of several sectoral exemptions, including those for some of the industries that have most of the trade with China, most of the US imports from China. So when all is said and done, you try to make sense of this, and you ask, well, is he going in the direction of more protection? Is he going in the direction of less protection? Does he want to negotiate trade deals with other countries so that they'll lower trade barriers? But the one thing that many of us have missed in all of that smokescreen is that during this process, the President of the United States has brought into the White House, into the executive branch, the authority to set tariffs, which is an authority that resides in Congress, according to the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And no other president had ever tried to do this. Mr. Trump used the International Economic Emergency Powers Act in order to claim that the government could, by declaring a national emergency caused presumably by the trade policies of other countries, he could declare a national emergency, take these emergency powers, and put in the office of the presidency the power to impose tariffs and the power to declare exemptions for those tariffs. And in fact, recently, last Wednesday, when he was apparently backtracking on the tariffs, reporters asked him, well, how are you going to grant exemptions from these tariffs? And he said, yes, some firms are going to need that. How are you going to decide on those exemptions? And Mr. Trump responded instinctively. And that, for me, carries a very clear message. There are no rules. There is just access. This is very similar, for example, to something that Juan Domingo Perón did in 1946. He nationalized banking deposits. He had the central bank take over all of the deposits of all commercial banks and then lend them back to the commercial banks so that they could give loans. And what was the effect of that? If you try to make sense of the macroeconomic effect, it doesn't really appear as it makes any difference. But what it was doing is that it was bringing the decision, the discretionality to decide who could and could not get loans in the economy into the hands of the executive. So it doesn't have to make economic sense. It has to make political sense. It has a political logic of accumulating control. And relations with Latin America, I think, also have to be seen in this prism. So why was Mr. Trump today with Mr. Bukele? Mr. Bukele, the president of El Salvador, is helping Trump carry out his deportation policies. And what's extremely important about the deportation policies is, from the standpoint of the Trump administration, is that they're being carried out without due process. Again, in invocation this time of the Alien Enemies Act, in which he's declared a criminal gang of Venezuela, which is the Tren de Aragua. He has claimed that the U.S. is under invasion, that this gang is led from Venezuela by Nicolas Maduro, and that it is invading the U.S. And why does he do that? Because that allows him to treat Venezuelans who are charged with his administration. And charge is even not the correct word, because it's just his administration just simply has to state that they are members of the Tren de Aragua, and they are denied due process. They are treated like enemy combatants, like prisoners of war, and therefore they're summarily deported. And in Nayib Bukele's visit today, there's been a Supreme Court order in which the Supreme Court, by a 9-0 vote, asked the administration to facilitate the return of a wrongly deported Salvadoran man who had been deported to El Salvador. So it's the Supreme Court telling the administration that it has to do something. And what did the Trump administration say? We don't have any control over that. That is up to the government of El Salvador. And what did the president of El Salvador say? Well, I can't smuggle back a terrorist into the US. What do you expect me to do? So in fact, there was a very strong signal there also that Mr. Trump is saying, I don't really care what the Supreme Court justices tell me to do. I'm not going to do it, and I can assert the authority not to do it. So I view Latin America relations in this period as something that has to be seen first through the prism of a government that's trying to accumulate and concentrate power in the executive branch. And I think that other leaders of the region play an important role. Those who are willing to collaborate, like Bukele, they are going to have the red carpet. those who are not, look at, there's something really interesting right now. After China, which are the two countries on which Mr. Trump has most raised tariffs to this date, to today, as of today? Canada and Mexico. Canada and Mexico have 25% tariff rates. The rest of the world has 10% tariff rates. So the 90-day pause in the tariffs was not applied to the two neighbors of the US. That is also an assertion of authority. So if you're close, you have to follow the orders of the US. Why? Because this is the US sphere of authority. That is the way in which it is conceived. And that effectively means that if you are either on the good side of Mr. Trump or you're not. And if you're not, then life is going to get a lot tougher for you. Which brings us to Venezuela. So Venezuelan policy has also seen this pendulum shift during the administration. It began with a trip of Richard Grenell, who's a special envoy for the special situation of Mr. Trump. He went to Venezuela. He met with President Maduro. He brought back some Americans who had been detained in Venezuela, and he announced that an agreement had been reached with the Maduro administration for the return of Venezuelan deportees that were being deported to Venezuela. This in itself was actually a remarkable change because it implied that the US administration was in fact recognizing Mr. Maduro, was sending an envoy to meet publicly with him. This, even when Biden sent Juan Gonzalez in 2022, it was a secret meeting. It didn't occur before the cameras. So there was the initial statement was, in fact, one in which there was an engagement, a policy of engagement with Caracas that seemed to be a remarkable change from what had happened before. However, we've now had a turn. After a few weeks, Mr. Trump announced that licenses for export of Venezuelan oil that have been granted to Chevron and other companies would be revoked. And those licenses have, in fact, been revoked. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, Chevron, which had an extension of that license as part of a wind down period, it was actually forced to unload oil that it had loaded into a tanker of Venezuelan oil because U.S. authorities could essentially told them, look, you can no longer pay for Venezuelan oil. You can take the oil, but you can't pay for it. Of course, Venezuela said, if you're not going to pay for that, then you have to give it back. So now we're returning to a policy of maximum pressure, similar to the one in the first Trump administration. But there's a couple of things that are interesting here, and here's the relationship with Mr. Bukele plays an important role. Because something that has happened, and in itself it's an interesting question why it has happened, is that border apprehensions, which are an indicator of irregular migration into the US, have dropped remarkably during the Trump administration. And basically, I think that this is essentially, people are afraid that they're going to get deported. They are afraid of hostile treatment, so that makes them much less willing to come in. So to the extent that, from the standpoint of the Trump administration, it's if we were able, then with these signals of the deportation and with the tough treatment that we're giving migrants, we're able to stop the flow. Then, we don't necessarily, Venezuela doesn't necessarily matter that much in that if we continue to destroy the Venezuelan economy through sanctions, well, those migrants are not necessarily going to come into the US because now it's clear that we're deporting them from the US. They'll go to Colombia, they'll go to Peru, they'll go to other countries. That's not our problem, that's their problem. So again, this is viewed from the prism of the objectives of the Trump administration, the domestic objectives, particularly in terms of immigration, and its capacity to assert support. But the other interesting element is that the conversations between Grenell and Maduro continue, even though they're kind of not high profile, they continue. And what's being dealt with both in their conversation, the conversations of the Trump administration with Maduro and with the opposition, is something that in fact was already present in the first Trump administration, which is essentially, they're telling both groups, what can you give us in terms of access to Venezuelan natural resources? So the bottom line, yes, I mean, Trump is playing tough, but at the same moment, they're sending feelers to Venezuela that they would be willing to negotiate a deal in which if Venezuela gives the U.S. or U.S. companies preferential access to its oil wealth, just like they did with Ukraine, then maybe they'll be able to cut a deal. And there's a very interesting signal that Trump sent to this effect, which is that when he announced tariffs, there's a long list of countries. And as all of you know, there's even an island with penguins in that list. And Venezuela was on that list. But there were some countries that were not on that list. Russia was not on that list. Belarus was not on the list. North Korea was not on the list. Cuba was not on the list. What was the explanation given by the Trump administration? Those are sanctioned countries. We don't do trade with them. So why is Venezuela included in the list if it's a sanctioned country? Well, that's precisely the signal that the Trump administration is sending to Maduro. We're here, and in fact, they gave Venezuela a tariff rate of 15%. They gave Guyana a tariff rate of 38%. They gave Israel 17%, Europe 20%. Venezuela actually ended up being relatively well treated in this. The signal that they're sending is, if you give us enough of your natural resources, we're here to cut a deal.
Interesting. Well, the pizza arrived, and I know people are thinking about it. Let's let Arturo say a few words. Thank you for that, Francisco. And I've got some questions to follow up. Before we go to questions, we'll stop the pizza. Otherwise, people will be distracted the entire talk. But Arturo, please.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for this kind invitation, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with Francisco. I have been reading his work for quite a long time. Also your work, and Aaron didn't say, but he and Oliver were part of my dissertation committee, and I want to tell you how honorable this thing is. So let me talk about several things that my presentation will go in a different direction of what Francisco said. So probably we will be happy that we complement each other. The first thing that I'm going to tell you is that there is a lot of talk about how Latin America is a priority for the Trump administration. I will begin by saying I don't believe so. I think this is a mistake. There are issues that are motivated by American domestic politics that are a priority of the Trump administration, and they have a Latin American dimension. But Latin America as a region is not a priority of the Trump administration. How I'm going to say that? Well, the two arguments to claim that now Latin America finally is going to get a lot of attention. I always remember that Fernando Enrique Cardoso used to say that the best option for Latin America is fly low and not bring a lot of attention, because many times when it brings attention, it's either on a crisis or the wrong kind of attention. And I'm quoting Fernando Enrique Cardoso because since I have social democratic sympathies, I don't want to quote Fidel Castro that used to say that there, when the Americans give us attention, is when it's more dangerous, is what Fidel Castro used to say. But let's stay on the Fernando Enrique Cardoso side. Okay, so what are the two arguments that I say? First, that now migration is an important element, and therefore without Latin America, you cannot solve the issue of migration. Everything I have seen about migration, it is telling Latin American countries, you need to get back our deportees. If you don't do it, prepare that I'm gonna punish you very seriously. And the Pedro incident is what it said. And it's more or less the same with the issue of drugs. And finally, in a kind of derivation of the conflict, great power rivalry with China, then you see that there is a call for cutting down the relation with China, reducing trade with China, reducing contracts with China, with the Chinese. But again, it's not Latin America, and it's not the policy that you will assume a great power will do in its near abroad of the kind of solutions that I wrote in my dissertation that are acknowledgement of sovereignty in exchange for deference to what the great powers are. There is not this type of relationship that tend to normalize asymmetric relations is not what is in the making. And the other element that the people mention is that there is a group of Cubans. I am Cuban, and if you don't know, you don't notice my accent by now, but there are a lot of Cubans in the administration and people from South Florida. And these people know how to speak Spanish, they know the region, and they have followed the region for a long time. How beautiful. No, it's not true. The majority of them are real estate agents in South Florida. A guy that was a lobbyist like Mauricio Claver Caron, a lobbyist for a pro-embargo, pro-economic war position for quite a long time. He was in the Inter-American Development Bank. He had an issue there of ethics or something like that. But he doesn't have any record of participating in solving the traditional problems of the region or of the region with the relationship of the region with the United States. And he is the most prepared person. He and Rubio are the most prepared people among them. The rest are people that have been big donors of the Trump campaign. One guy that is a great insurance agent in Miami, so it's a great experience of Latin America. He speaks Spanish. And the other guy is a real estate agent for Panama, the country that President Trump dedicated more time in his inaugural address. And by the way, he has not talked about Panama during the whole electoral campaign. So can we say that those are the credentials to say that he's going to dedicate the priority to the region? I think that we should begin by disposing from this wrong assumption. So what are the priorities then, or how does this touch the case of Latin America, or the policy toward Latin America? I think that Francisco mentioned the treatment that it's given to migrants, that is not the kind of treatment that you will expect will take us to some kind of normalization or some stability in the regional front. In order to use the Alien Enemies Act that is from the Adams administration, it's very useful to know how the Adams administration, as part of the conflict with France, this is the guideline for dealing with Latin American migrants in the 21st century. Okay? So people will call it anachronistic or anachronic. No, I don't know what is the right word in English, but it's out of time what they are saying. And the idea is to cope with the migration crisis, that is a crisis. And I admit that the situation was out of control, and it's logical to establish some controls and things like that. But quoting these two great communists that run for the Republican candidacy in 1980, George Herbert Walker Bush and Ronald Reagan, in their debate in Austin, Texas, these two great communists say that the way to deal with those migrants is trying to help to stabilize the countries from where they were coming from. And they were referring to Mexico, and they would say, we don't win as Americans alone by creating more instability in the region. I hope that you know that if Stalin wake up and know who we are calling now communists or leftist ideas, probably Stalin would say that he's not even communist anymore. Because obviously what I think Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush said is something that makes sense from the point of view of any of the major theories of international relations foreign policy. And here the fundamental issue is that if you begin to treat, basically the law established that to deport without fundamental guarantees of due process, and it has to do with the identity of the United States as a republic, you need to basically say that the country is under an invasion or a predatory incursion is the other way that the law established. And then in order to do, you have to say that, and even the law talk about nations, and in this case they updated the view and it said we cannot talk about only invading nations because there are groups like the Tren de Aragua, and the Tren de Aragua is the invader now, and Maduro has something to do with the Tren de Aragua, and Cuba has something to do because it supports Maduro, and then America has been invaded by Cuba and Venezuela. I think you don't need to a degree from Cornell to know that this is kind of overstretched diagnosis. Okay? It's and by the way, this is something that is not new. Recently, several of the people that have been receiving the funding from USAID and National Endowment for Democracy in Miami, they were formulating this, framing this type of idea. They were saying that anybody who votes against a resolution to condemn, who vote against the resolution to condemn Russian invasion of Ukraine were invading Ukraine, and therefore they should be punished. And Cuba and Venezuela should be punished because of their cooperation with the invasion of Ukraine. The only thing that happened is that the United States abstained and voted against a resolution that condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine with Trump. So they were asking Biden to do that, but now they have a problem with this wide concept of invasion. Whoever I don't like is an invader, and we need to punish and sanction them. And I'm not saying that the United States should not take into account the behavior of those countries and how they align or not align with human rights issues, with friendly or unfriendly great powers in the relationship with the United States. But there should be some kind of guideline, role of the institutions that, as Francisco said, show an institutional maturity. And I see that in a debate in Latin America. I have a daughter that she's 4, almost 5, and I have some resonance about how to treat a toddler when people began to say, no, Claudia treat him in one way, and then we need to treat him like Claudia because she never say no to him directly, but manipulate him and say, yes, we're gonna send some troops, and then there will be people in the border, and then no. Petro made a mistake when he say no, because he doesn't take no for an answer. Well, I know that this is complex because I don't know how many of us are parents. I know that Aaron, I know his daughters, and he knows my daughter. And yes, it's true that my daughter sometimes doesn't take no for an answer. But I thought that if we are dealing with international relations issues and foreign policy issues, we can bring something more sophisticated to the analysis than things like that. And why we are engaging in this type of conversation? Because what Francisco just presented, the type of populism, right or left, that has a direct relationship with the people. There is no institution. The leader defines who is the people and who is not the people. And in foreign policy, have absolute discretionary powers. So it's something that, in my view, we need to take into account when we talk about this issue. So let me, there are more things that we can talk. I'm preparing a book about triangular relationship, Cuba with Russia, Cuba with triangular, always with the United States. Cuba, Canada, and the United States, Cuba, Russia, and the United States, Cuba, Europe, and the United States, Cuba, China, and the United States. And in my view, let me address that the position in the great power rivalry is shaping a lot the rhetoric, but still we don't know how much this can be effective in Latin America. And I'm afraid, I am a proud American citizen, that Trump thinks that the United States is more powerful in Latin America than what it really is. There are several countries in Latin America that today had such a close relationship with China that even right-wing politicians like Bolsonaro, who came to Brazilian politics with a clear anti-Chinese pronouncement, he ended on, by members of his own coalition, pushed to keep some kind of balance in the relationship with the United States. And not everybody is Panama, and even Panama is difficult now to do something like rolling back the glorious. And let me tell you like that. You go and you read, for instance, the Linowitz report in 1974, the glorious negotiation by first Henry Kissinger and then by Saul Linowitz of a solution to the asymmetric conflict of a colonial nation between the United States and Panamanian nationalism. And this is something that is an element that we need to take a look at that, because there might be elements in which mentioning the Monroe Doctrine, should we say bitching would be the wrong word in this country, no, or bad mouthing, no, or speaking bad about China and all this, but it is there are limits to what the United States can do in the region without planting the seed of strong anti-Americanism, and that's something as an American citizen and someone that knows well the history of Latin America, I think it will be a big mistake. And Russia, and with that I conclude, Russia might agree in principle with this idea of a concert of great powers, and you respect my incursion in my near abroad, and then I will be more deferential to your area of influence. But let me remind you two things. In one of the most important papers that we can find about this idea of concert of great powers, Robert Jervis warns us that concert lasts very little. It's very unusual in international relations to have long periods of great powers concerts. So I think that it's, even if Trump is able to pull out his Kissinger in reverse strategy of peeling off Russia from China, I don't think that Putin, who is an extreme realist, is going to buy that this is going to last forever. And I think that Russia, one of the few areas in which it has some very important allies is in Latin America. I don't think they are going to forget about Venezuela. They are going, as long as Maduro is in power, and for sure, there is a Cuba lobby in Moscow that is not gonna let Cuba loose and short. So I'm gonna stop it here. I don't know if I passed the minute.
I've got this one, but no, that's fine. Thanks so much, both of you. I do have a number of questions. I think we should let everybody grab pizza before they storm the stage, and then we'll pick up with a bit of a conversation. Ask our presenters a few questions and make sure that there's time for everybody else to participate too. But
And you followed the instructions in terms of the title of the event, Trump 2.0 in Latin America, and much of what we heard was really a vision of sort of how to understand what's going on in the White House and how that's being projected outwards to Latin America. We didn't hear as much, and so I'd like to ask Francisco first, and then Arturo. We didn't hear as much about the different scenarios for Latin American reaction. We heard about Bukele, of course, and we heard a few individual countries, and perhaps that's all we can expect, is that there will be one by one negotiations and hub and spoke sorts of relationships between the U.S. and all of the different Latin American countries. But I do see some, categorization and groupings of Latin American countries, partly political, but also in terms of their trade and other relationships with the U.S. that suggest that there can be an alternative and some alternative narratives and policy demands and pushback to what you described as far as the U.S. relationship with Latin America. So if you can elaborate a little bit on sort of what's coming from Latin America and what are the possible scenarios that we can imagine as far as a Latin American voice or platform or agenda that responds.
Okay, well, let me start out and I'll actually start out from one of Arturo's comments and with respect to how to deal with Trump and the analogy of a toddler. And I was telling Arturo during the break that yes, I mean, one way of thinking about this is, Trump just thinks like a toddler and you have to treat him like a toddler. And I'm actually going to take issue with that. And I'm going to take issue with it because as I said, I think that Trump has a lot of similarities with some other leaders that have studied, like Chavez, like Mugabe, like Peron, and it's very common to characterize them as people who don't know what they're doing. But then they turn out to be very successful politicians, and they turn out to stay in power for long, and they turn out to have these big political comebacks when most people effectively believe that Trump was dead politically 4 years ago. And not only is he back, I mean, he's back, he's in power, and he's asserting a level of power and of authority that nobody really thought that he could have. So there's a level at which I see something more complex here. And I think that what happens is that given that there is a project around Trump of concentrating authority in the executive branch, and what I'm going to say is scary, but it's that once you've gone this far in this project, then it's very costly for you to give up power again. I mean, if you look at this from the perspective of Trump, he's thinking, well, I was out of office for 4 years, and they basically almost threw me in jail. So that means that there has to be a thought process of how do I stop that from happening, which is either how do I get reelected or how do I make sure that a successor of mine gets reelected. And that might require, and probably will require, undermining institutions that can serve as checks and balances in the US. So in that sense, what he's trying to project is authority, and he's trying to scare actors who could resist him, including the Supreme Court, into not opposing him. Then the worst thing that can happen is all of a sudden for like some kind of Canadian premier or somebody else from Latin America, like a Colombian president, to say, no, I'm going to contest your authority. Then part of Trump's logic has to be, no, I mean, I have to make it extremely costly for these people not to respect my authority, because if not, that's going to undermine my whole domestic project. So then to your question, well, how does Latin America react to this? And what is it that we're seeing in Sheinbaum's response? I mean, all of this sounds terrible and unusual, and it is. at the same time, from the standpoint of Latin America and from the standpoint of many Latin American politicians, including many on the left, this is actually pretty much the US that they're used to. This is the US that they've had to deal with. I mean, this is a US that pretended to be something else domestically, but when it came time to asserting its relation with Latin America, then many times it was the brute exercise of force. So in that sense, I think that many of these Latin American leaders are actually used to, hey, we're the David fighting against the Goliath. We have to be smart about this, and that means that when you have a figure like this one who's trying to impose authority, who's trying to look powerful, let him look powerful. Now, there's another issue which is, I think, like really, really relevant here in terms of understanding the relationship, which is that it's actually quite curious if you look at the tariffs that Trump imposed. In a lot of Latin America, not all of it, but a lot of Latin America had the lowest level of tariffs, which is 10%. Now, why is that? Because the US has a trade surplus with these countries. So the US doesn't have a trade deficit. The US is actually exporting a lot more to these countries than what it's importing. And that also colors the relationship. Now, there's another element here which I think is very important to take into account, which is that, and it gets back to the point that Arturo was making, there is, I think, a fundamental flaw to the thinking both of Trump, but also of previous administrations in their chance to exercise global authority, which is that it's not clear that the US really has the power to do what it's trying to do. The US economy at this moment is, depending on how you value it, if you value it at purchasing power parity prices, which I think is the correct way to do it, it's smaller than the Chinese economy. And there's also another fundamental difference, which is that China is a net lender. So the US is borrowing money from the rest of the world. China has money to lend to the rest of the world. And by the way, if China engages in a trade war with the US, the real nuclear weapon that China has in its trade war, which it has has not begun to use yet, is to start selling US treasuries. So if China starts dumping US debt, that can easily provoke a fiscal crisis in the US. And this also means that in the long term, China has a significant amount of leverage with the region, with Latin America, because China is an alternative creditor. China has the capacity to lend, it has lent, and it can lend a lot more, much more so if it's not lending to the US. So I think that ultimately what you might be seeing in the region in the long run is a realignment to actually be much less dependent on the US. And I think that you're going to see many countries, and I think that you're also going to see the Chinese reacting to this, naturally reacting to the confrontation that Trump has imposed by saying, okay, well, fine, you guys are declaring economic war on us, you're declaring trade war on us. We're going to use our levers to create another trading bloc. And I think that capacity to lend is going to make it really important in Latin America, much more so if what's happening right now to the US debt market continues happening, which is interest rates on US debt are going to continue to increase, yields are going to continue to increase, and therefore the capacity to give cheap credit, which China has, is going to be fundamental in international relations.
Well, first of all, let me answer Francisco's answer to what I said. Perhaps I was not sufficiently clear. I was not presenting President Trump as a toddler. I was criticizing the type of analysis that has prevailed in international relations circles and political analysis, for instance, in the Sunday talk shows that political junkies like me watch every Sunday, in which the conversation about Trump treating as a toddler And I think that there is a lot of theory and work on the idea of political psychology and the role of individuals, particularly as you did it in the case of Chavez, about what I will call a populist style. I think that populism is not an ideology, is not a political position. Populism is a style in politics that requires some level of charisma. And let me tell you, once I was going to Chile, and my plane was delayed in Dallas, President Trump in 2016 was speaking in the stadium there. And I took advantage and I went there. And he is a charismatic leader for his followers. And he established a direct relation with his follower that doesn't go through the institution of the Republican Party. And what I would say is, once you assume that, then let's study how leaders of this kind are treated. And I found that what you have said is correct. So I'm not arguing against what you say, is that perhaps my original idea was not well presented. If what I said is that he's a kind of immature leader, someone that is still in high school or something like that. I know very well that he's already graduated from the Wharton School, and he has several elements that brought him to the presidency, not once, but twice. Only Grover Cleveland has done that in American history, a comeback of this kind. So that's why I think that we need to look at more issues. The answer should be what is happening with the institutions. What can we do, let's say a country like Canada, a country that has a free trade with the United States like Mexico, beyond being tough in the way that Claudia Sheinbaum was tough and nice and speaking good English. So are there policies that without looking like a domestic lobby, because foreign countries should not look as domestic lobbies, but they have ways that they can send proper signals, proper messages to the different sides in the U.S. system in ways that they can play a more important, facilitate the role that defend and strengthen American institutions. Because in the end, for the good of the country, is not a fight between the opponents and the followers of President Trump, but defend what has been good in America for quite a long time. I know that in Latin America, we have a lot of experience of bad laws from Congress, bad decisions from the Supreme Court. Don't get me on the Helms-Burton law, because I'm going to tell you how Congress sometimes is worse than the president. But in the end, and this is something that touched not the policy towards Latin America, even the Republican condition with lower R of the country in which we live. So I think that what I want to say about that is of this kind. And let me give you an example about Cuba, a country that I follow a lot. It's true that President Trump, obviously Cuba is sanctioned, and it's very interesting that now a lot of politicians from center right, center left, right wing, let me give you an example. Álvaro Uribe was all the time saying that Cuba and Venezuela are in such bad situation, not because of the sanctions. Don't come and tell me that. Everything is a responsibility of the Maduro's government and the Fidel Castro that turned down this country to ruins. And now, when it's only a tariff of 25% to Colombia, he simply say, Petro is destroying the Colombian economy. He is bringing on us a 25% tariff, and this will be destructive for our economy. This means war. That was what Uribe said. And I don't know if this is correct in Colombian terms, but let me tell you, if we talk about an economic war, the one against Cuba has no parallel, and it's not a 25% tariffs. It's a tarifón, to say it in Spanish, no? It's a big, huge tariffs in which all kind of commerce, except the possibility of selling food to Cuba, to pay in cash, is part of the relationship between Cuba and the United States. And by the way, they go after third countries that want to trade with Cuba and say, if you trade with Cuba, we're going to punish you. So, something that we need to welcome Mr. Uribe's statement is that we now know that economic wars are part of statecraft. And Francisco has developed a lot of work on this. I have my own work about that, but not of the level that Francisco has produced on that. Joe, I think that there are things that I'm gonna say here because I was invited to talk about that, so I'm gonna say my opinion. At times it might go out of the box. But I wonder, and I want to hear also your opinion, Francisco, is what will happen if the United States say, you know what, we cannot honor the treasury bonds as they are. And if they plan, if they are smart, as I know that some of them are, unfortunately for them, in my view, they don't want to put there Robert Lighthizer, who had some economic theory behind. I don't know if you know, if someone knows very well this formula with some Greek letters about how they target different percentage to every country, well, I would be very glad to hear the explanation. But if even Paul Krugman couldn't understand it, I'm afraid that I am below this league. Okay? But Dodge, there was a lot of kerfuffle with Dodge having access to information that was specific to the Treasury Department. And I don't know, since I have seen a lot of economic work, I think that it's very easy to accept that the United States cannot pull out a Nixon. And when I talk about a Nixon, it's Nixon and the gold standard and all this. I know that a default or a renegotiation or something like that on the value of U.S. debt might damage significantly the dollar and the trust that we have in the world we have in the American economy and American debt. But I'm not sure that Trump is not ready to do anything to deal with problems of this nature. So I'm going to leave it there. And something that in my view is very important is the issue of this view about what is hegemony and the relationship between countries. For anyone that studied political economy in the last 40, 50 years, this notion that Latin America has been taking advantage of the United States in the last 10, 20 years of that. Other countries have been doing that. Even China, I think, is questionable. There are a lot of people inside the United States that has adopted a model that has perpetuated a lot of the inequalities and they have decided to take advantage of trade gains without helping to compensate or to recycle or retrain the losers of the free trade proposition. Let's remember that no other than Carlos Salinas in the Houston dialogue with President Bush, he offered the idea of creating compensatory funds as part of NAFTA. And it was President Bush, the one who said, if you introduce that in the idea of NAFTA, the agreement is dead. We will not be able to convince any Americans to pay taxes to compensate losers in Mexico or losers of the free trade in the United States. So it was, let's remember, someone that is the closest thing to a delinquent, a criminal in Latin American politics. Although we have people that have been worse than Salinas. But we are talking about his life as a life of crime and a kind of Sopranos in Mexico. Okay? But still, he was able to say something like, you know, it will be good if we follow some of the models in Europe of creating some compensatory funding. And it was the United States, basically the one that said, it's not in our model, it's not in our type of capitalism to have this type of thing. So eventually what they did is they create a voluntary funding that companies, corporations, individuals can donate money for some kind of support, and it was a demand of American trade union, by the way. Trade unions were talking about this issue. So let me mention for a moment on the issue of Cuba. That is a topic that I already mentioned. I believe that any judgment about Trump and the policies that he's applying to Cuba and the policies of Trump are extremely dangerous in the current moment. I don't want to alarm anybody, but if tomorrow I know that there is a collapse of the Cuban government, I will not be surprised. Something that I have never said in my life, I'm going to tell you that. The situation is really, really worse, really bad. And the Cuban opposition has no capacity to articulate now an alternative, but people to live need food, transportation, and housing. And the level of the crisis is particularly bad, particularly bad. And for 4 years between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, there was a Biden administration. And I'm telling you something, I was a PhD student here, and I was a consultant. I'm not among the glorious graduate of this school, but something that gives me pride is that when I was a PhD student here, I was a consultant of the State Department under Obama. And I say that the policies of President Biden, compared to what Obama did, were really, really bad. President Biden, I know that with Venezuela he explored the possibilities of engagement, but with Cuba he promised a policy of Obama plus more human rights dimension, but he didn't introduce any major change in the policies of Trump 1.0. And it's important to know about what President Trump has done, but President Trump basically closed the Obama policy. President Biden ran on the platform that he will go back to engagement, to a policy of more travel to Cuba, more remittances, support to the private sector in Cuba, because Cuba is a post-totalitarian society with very little plurality in the economy. So the more you push for the development of the private sector, the more autonomy you can feed in civil society and feed opportunities to challenge the government in a civilized, non-zero-sum game. And President Biden if President Trump made a policy that was based on make Rubio happy, President Biden made a policy that was make Menendez happy. And that's something that need to be said.
Great. I want to make sure that we don't miss out on hearing from Ali. And Petro has come up a couple times. Colombia's come up a couple times, and in the break, actually, we were observing, and Arturo observed that, you know, as we all may remember, there was a kerfuffle right at the beginning of the Trump administration when Petro stood up and said, well, we won't accept these migrants being sent home in dignified fashion and shackles and all the rest. And that confrontation lasted, as I was reminded, about 2 days. So what do we make of Petro and the approach that Petro took? What does that tell us about Colombia? Colombia's got an election coming up. My next question for all of us has to do with the Latin American right. Noboa just won in Ecuador. I'm not sure what to make of the scenario politically across Latin America in terms of the rise of Noboa and Bukele and Milei and these other actors and what that means for a relationship with Trump. But Ali, tell us a little bit about what's happening in Colombia, what we make of that episode, and why aren't we hearing anything about Colombia anymore?
Happy to, should I use the mic?
Yeah.
I'll be brief because I know we want to get to some audience questions, but this has been a great panel so far. Thank you, Arturo and Francisco. So yeah, in the very first week of the administration, there was this basically a spat over whether or not Colombia would accept deportees, and Gustavo Petro said, well, if you're going to do it, at least send them in a humane way, not sort of on the floor of a cargo plane. And that was sort of the issue that he decided to confront Trump on right away, and basically folded almost immediately, in part due to domestic pressure within Colombia. And so kind of in that sense, immediately Petro kind of shot his credibility. And I would argue there's sort of some similar parallels in terms of how they operate. I'll just say that in December, I took a group of Corbell students down for a class in Colombia, which was a great class. And things, actually Victoria was in the group, and we saw, we heard stories about sort of difficult situations in Colombia. Things have gotten a lot worse, even since our trip. And I think the dynamic and relationship has changed quite a bit. I was just going to say, I think in some ways Trump and Petro are opposites. One is a New York businessman, the other is a leftist former guerrilla. Petro supports human rights, indigenous rights, women's rights, climate change, all that stuff. You have Trump, who came in, immediately announcing pardons of January 6th, rioters, insurrectionists, snatching people off the street against trans rights, against DEI. So, at some level, you might say they have kind of nothing really in common in terms of issues, but they actually have a lot of similarities, I think, like more similar than they'd like to maybe admit. They're both like pretty erratic in a lot of ways. They ignore their advisors. They're prone to late night tweets and screeds because they both stay up late and wake up in the middle of the night and do things like that. And, in some sense, they both kind of shot their credibility. I think with the tariffs, Trump had all this bluster, and then, when push came to shove, he folded like a lawn chair, just like Petro did when he was kind of getting the pushback. So, I think Trump obviously has more power. The other sort of similarity I'll just point out is that in Colombia, there's been an effort to negotiate peace agreements with the various remaining armed groups, from sort of former paramilitary to guerrilla to criminal. And Petro is largely proven completely incapable of doing that, although there's sort of a budding deal with a very small group right now. And I think, Trump is sort of prone to that same kind of bluster in terms of, I'm going to solve all these different conflicts on day one. And it's like, okay, well, you've got Yemen, you've got Gaza, you've got like South Sudan, Ukraine, all these issues. And it's just not clear, sort of like Petro, if he has the ability to do that. So there's sort of some, I think, similarities in terms of sort of the scattered nature, not having advisors, maybe not having good advisors because of a sort of more personalist nature. I think just some of the issues that are going to remain are like the drug issue, and probably still finding some way to accommodate on a deal on drug exports. Although I think the kind of emphasis in the U.S. and particularly by the Trump administration on fentanyl as the main kind of drug threat is going to actually kind of reduce the importance and focus of Colombian cocaine. Although that's still going to continue. They've had some interdictions. The other thing I'll sort of mention is I think that, in some ways, Petro is maybe more of an institutionalist. Like the election's coming up, I don't see him trying to hang on to power. I think he might try to support, favored candidate, but I think, so far Trump has at least had talk of like the third term issue, and so it's not clear how that's gonna play out. But I think what's happening now is going to shape the Colombian elections. I think, from what we heard in Colombia, it's going to be sort of either center-right, maybe center-left, possibly a right person, depending on how the first round of elections go, sort of early middle of next year. So in a sense, I think, the way Petro is engaged with Trump probably hurt his chances to be sort of a revitalized political force. So just to wrap up, I think the kind of biggest actually theme we see with Trump is sort of, we see him pushing, the migrants back and sort of adding these tariffs and sort of picking fights and, launching off some missiles to Yemen based on a group chat, things like that. But, his sort of nature is more isolationist, nativist. And I think, we've kind of heard this in the conversation that he'll probably, maybe have less engagement or do things sort of transactionally on a one-by-one kind of basis. That said, I think the way that Trump has shifted U.S. policy and bureaucracy is going to have significant effects on Colombia in one particular way, which is on the conflict and security issues and the sort of peace processes that are underway. And I think probably the biggest thing that is happening is sort of these economic forces. So Colombia is the biggest recipient of USAID, was the biggest recipient of USAID money in the Americas, and there were a lot of programs there, in particular in support of the peace process, the 2016 peace agreement. It had a USIP, U.S. Institute of Peace office that we met with, and those have all been basically shut down. And those were operating in sort of the most sensitive areas right now as sort of conflict has been increasing, like along the Venezuelan border and other areas. That combined with even a 10% tariff is going to, affect some of the exports, agricultural exports of these areas. And so I think that's really kind of, could be pushing Colombia toward more of a tipping point in terms of like renewed conflict, even though Petro is trying to negotiate like 6 deals at once. So, I think that's sort of probably the biggest risk going forward is how does kind of Colombia recover from its biggest donor disappearing, especially when they were supporting sort of the conflict-prone areas as the country is tipping back toward greater insecurity. So anyway, that's all I got to say. And thanks, Bill, for an excellent panel.
Yeah. Since the microphone's over there, why don't we just start passing around? Are there folks who want to offer a question or observation on what you've heard so far?
Do you want to ask
I've got
first?
some question. You go first.
Yeah, thanks y'all for being here and for such a great panel. I have a question kind of for everybody, but specifically for Francisco. Yeah, you mentioned the kind of more public meeting between the Trump administration and the Maduro administration, but then obviously when the Venezuelan elections happened, the US government came out, saying that those elections are not legitimate. And so I think how do you square those two encounters? How do you see that impacting the Venezuelan opposition? Do you think there's still hope there? And just how do you make sense of these two very conflicting actions?
I saw one other hand here. Let's grab two, just in the interest of being efficient on all this, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I appreciate the discussion. My question is to anyone who would like to answer first on the panel. When it comes to certain political theaters in Latin America, like Argentina, it seems that the US has a vested interest in making sure that certain candidates win over others. Javier Milei ran talking about rejecting ties, cutting ties with China on various issues. And when he did become president, he did cut a multitude of projects. Famously, as one example a year ago, stopped shipments of Chinese Air Force jets to Argentina and replaced them with F-16s. So it seems that there's a strategic relationship developing very deeply between Argentina and the United States. So my question to the panel is, do you see Latin America being reignited as a place for political conflict and potentially, in extreme cases, proxy conflict as part of the new Cold War that is coming to be between China and the United States?
Great. Why don't you use this one?
Well, let me take the last question, and I will connect it with something that Aaron asked earlier. I stopped because I know that I was taking more time. I think that something that recently happened, and I suggest anyone that want to explore this issue, is the declassification of documents around the JFK Act. There is a lot of good materials that is not about the conspiracy theories about who killed President Kennedy. But since Al Oswald was trying, for instance, to go to Cuba, and the CIA was involved in multiple events, now there has been declassification of a lot of documents related to US interference in political processes in the region. I think that the way that by the 70s, for instance, in some of these documents that has been declassified, show that the United States is far from the United States that was at the beginning of the 60s, at the beginning of during the 50s. Let me give you an example about that. When you read the document that George Kennan wrote after going through Latin America and producing a report about the dangers of nationalism, in which he said that nationalists were more a problem than communists because Latinos were very passionate. They don't think with their mind, they think with their heart. It's a kind of racist stereotypes that you see that by the 1970s, the American establishment has passed the page on that. I'm afraid that this discussion about cheat hole countries, the presentations about people of Latin America as invaders, connect with racist stereotypes that some segments that were pushed outside of the American establishment can come and play a role in that. And what is the direct consequences of that? Well, look at what Kennan said. Since the Latinos are so passionate that they cannot think clearly, which is, by the way, one of the groups that were very passionate were the Adecos, these very dangerous communists that we have in Venezuela, no? That eventually all of them were brought to be important part of the Alliance for Progress in the 1960s, because the several of people that were disqualified to run their countries in the Kenyan vision were later declared kosher. But should I explain what kosher is? Or everybody knows, no? Were declared kosher later, including Orlando Letelier, for instance, was the assistant of Felipe Herrera, who was the president of the IDB in 1960s. But eventually, when all these anti-democratic dynamics took place, because remember, when you have people that are so passionate that they cannot think clearly which is the institution that can provide stability, the army, the armed forces. And Jago was unstable in Brazil, and President Allende was unstable in Chile. So we need someone to treat those people that are not in the right mind. They are passionate, they think with their heart, not with their mind, with a treatment of military rule. I believe that we are past this time, but let's not forget that it's there. And if you read these documents, for instance, 1958, 1964, 1970, a huge amount of money was spent on blocking a democratic socialist candidate by the name of Salvador Allende Gossens. So it's something that we need to think about. And in the case of Cuba, let me say something that I like that President Trump did, is that with these Dodge investigations, they found a lot of things of the so-called democracy promotion programs that were really an affirmative action program for anti-communist Cubans in Florida. People that receive money for things that you cannot imagine. If you want, I can tell you a lot, but you can research on your own. And I think that we might expect that something like that happen if Latin America becomes a priority. But as I said, I don't believe that it's a priority right now, and I don't think that we are going to see a lot of money spent in electoral campaigns. In the case of Argentina, I believe that Milei is, in my view, he's a fraud. If these ideas that he's saying about how to run the economy and the magic hand of the market that is invisible and solve everything and all this, in my view, in a normal time, we will say that are words of a drunken sailor. But it might be that he is able to sell that because the Peronists were an example of the worst type of corruption. And you see people that are behaving opportunistic. I have followed Nayib Bukele for quite a long time because I have followed El Salvador. He was he was a protege. His protector was Jorge Chafik Handal. We remember who he was, no? Jorge Chafik Handal was one of the commanders of the FMLN, was a leftist of the leftists in the FMLN. And because of their common presence in the Palestinian community in Salvador, Jorge Chafik Handal brought under his wings Nayib Bukele. So it's very hard to say. I was watching today his conference with President Trump, but I think he is, and we are going to see, because of the social networks, because the new type of communication that we have that is affecting the way we do politics. Everywhere we are going to see this type of personalities that are Viktor Orban in Hungary, and then Nayib Bukele is the populist style. And obviously, the issue of crime is, Latin America is the region in the world with worse problems of public security. And I think this is something that whoever is able to grasp on that, the left can do it, the right can do it. Obviously, President Trump will prefer, in my view, a right-wing candidate. But I don't think that we are there where the United States will go and spend huge amount of money interfering in many of these elections. And what I read from what Francisco said is that in the case of Venezuela, hard interests, such as the oil business, is prevailing, or at least is competing with the views of the Cuban lobby in Florida. I'm telling you, in this administration, the Cuban lobby in Florida is playing a major role because of Secretary Rubio. And these people, contrary to what even Democrats said in the hearings, that they have democracy in their heart because they lost their country and things like that. This is a typical Cold War anti-communist lobby inserted in American politics. And I can tell you example. September 11, 1973. There was a city that has a big party in the streets when President Allende was overthrown. And no one ever has criticized the city for what they did. There was a huge party in front of the Versailles restaurant in Miami. Maria Elvira Salazar, the congresswoman from District 27, just a couple of days ago, say that Luis Posada Carriles is a hero, a patriot, and there is nothing to express regrets about. Okay? They went after Bernardo Leito, the vice president, not of Allende, of Frei, and because he was creating trouble to the Chilean junta, Pinochet, they put a bomb and shoot Bernardo Leito and his wife in Rome. This is not a democratic lobby that does that. This is an anti-communist lobby, and it's true. You know, what I think is that they should say it openly. But obviously, this doesn't sell well after the democratization wave in Latin America and in other places. But they have an agenda toward Latin America in which they want Novoa, they want Milei, but I see that the administration, that Rubio is not the president, and there are other tendencies there that are important to look at.
Well, I'm going to try to answer both questions and be mindful of time, but I think that both questions are really interesting. So let's start out with Venezuela. The fact that Marco Rubio is Secretary of State is really important, as Arturo was saying. And I think that that's marked a very important change in policy. And Rubio, to a certain extent, doesn't really have that much authority in some of the areas that Trump cares about, like Russia, Ukraine. So that actually leads him to say, well, you know, my sphere of authority is Latin America, and my natural sphere of authority is Cuba and Venezuela policy. So, you know, you describe, Arturo, like the first Trump administration was make Marco Rubio happy, then Biden was make Menendez happy. So the Trump 2.0 is make Marco Rubio happy again. So, so I think that there is a logic. I mean, this is what Rubio has thought about Venezuela and about Cuba, which is that these countries should face maximum pressure. Does he really believe that that's going to generate regime change in Venezuela? Maybe, maybe not, but it's just what his constituents want to hear. It makes him look tough. It makes him I mean, I would essentially put it as one of his objectives, and he's going to try to continue to pursue that line. Now, there is another group in the administration, which is the group that's led by Grinnell, and that's been trying to sell to Trump the idea of, look, let's have a transactional deal with Maduro, and let's do some type of a change, and maybe this can be really economically good for the U.S. It's about oil, it's about natural resources, and what I think is actually fundamentally true is that neither of these two sides care about democracy or human rights. I mean, they want to get their way in different ways. Like Grinnell is saying, I can live with a dictator. I don't mind, them being a dictator. That's fine. I mean, dictator's not a bad word for Trump. But we'll cut a deal that economically makes sense. Marco Rubio, I mean, he wants to get rid of Maduro, he'll say that Maduro is a horrible dictator. But in the end, if it were up to him to install a right-wing dictatorship in Venezuela, he would do it. And he applauds the Bukele regime, which is a regime that is essentially trampling on human rights. Going back to Menendez, I mean, Menendez was he was like the staunch opponents of the Cuban and Venezuelan dictatorships, and he was taking gold bars from one of probably the most brutal dictatorships right now in the world, which is the dictatorship of Egypt. So I think that we're right now. I do think that Rubio has the upper edge here, but it also has to do a lot with something that Arturo said, which is that the moment that there was a change in policy towards Venezuela, which was the moment in which Trump announced that he was revoking the Chevron license, he did it for a very specific reason, which is that he needed to get his budget bill, the reconciliation bill, passed. And he needed a favorable vote in Congress and the Republican majority, and on that bill, it was really slim. And there's 3 Republican legislators, Carlos Jimenez, Manuel Salazar, and Mauro Diaz-Balart, who have come to be known as the crazy Cubans. And they went to Trump and told him, you have our votes if you revoke the Chevron license, or if you reimpose maximum pressure sanctions on Venezuela. And the administration won that by 2 votes. So without these 3 legislators, it was 1 vote down. So they had to enter into this transaction. Now, is this group going to continue to have this power in the rest of the administration? Maybe. I mean, I do think that the Republican majority is going to continue to be slim. Now, it may be that we enter into a period where the logic operates at other levels, such as simply by the exercise of executive authority, even bypassing Congress, because that's what's happened with tariff policy. I mean, the government essentially took tariff policy away from Congress, and it's now setting it by itself. Now, the issue of China and the proxy war, I tell you, I think that Trump is going to wage a tariff war with China. He's waged it, and I think that he's going to lose it. And I think that he doesn't mind. And I think that he doesn't mind because Trump's project is one of consolidating domestic political authority. And this actually happens a lot with this type of administration. They pick external fights because those fights help them domestically. And they're willing to pay very high economic costs. And that's why, in my book, I came up with this idea of scorched earth politics. So, which is essentially, you're doing like armies when they're fighting in the middle of a war. You're burning fertile fields because that's part of your logic of control. And that's the only way in which you can prevail is if you weaponize the economy, and that implies turning the economy into a political battlefield. So what did we see? And with this, I wanted to get to a question of Arturo's, which I thought was really interesting. Would Trump default on the U.S. national debt? That's a really interesting and provocative question. And my answer is going to be no. He's just going to print money. I mean, he doesn't need to default. He needs to monetize the debt. And what he is going to do, and in fact, there is right now, so the administration fired 2 heads of agencies, and this case is going before the Supreme Court. And if the administration wins this case, they will actually achieve the authority, the legal authority, to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve. And this is extremely important. Recep Tayyip Erdogan also did this 2018. It fired the central bank governor, used that in order to get the central bank to lower interest rates ahead of the election, won re-election by manipulating monetary policy. It doesn't matter that after that inflation went up to 84%, this economic damage is collateral damage in the fact that Erdogan is still in power. So I think that what I do see happening right now is you have this massive steady increase in the yields of treasury bonds, which essentially means that the US is paying more for its debt. We have something even more remarkable, which is that the US dollar has dropped by 10% since the inauguration of Donald Trump. And the US dollar has dropped in the midst of a global crisis provoked by Donald Trump. And you might say, well, that makes sense. But actually, the US in 2008 also provoked the crisis, by the way, provoked by the deregulation that was done by the first G.W. Bush administration, including, if you think that Milei's chainsaws are new, there was James Gilleran, who was the head of the Office of Thrift Supervision. He also posed with a chainsaw in an event where they were presumably cutting red tape. And he was so aggressive, the regulator, that he was going to do it with a chainsaw. This guy was actually the regulator that was in charge of savings and loans associations and in charge of AIG, which fed the 2008 crisis. But my point is, the 2008 crisis was created by US policies. But nevertheless, at the time when the crisis erupted, there was a flight to safety in the US dollar. People wanted to have their money in US dollars. During the COVID pandemic, people wanted to have their money in US dollars. This is the first global crisis in which we're not seeing that. People are actually running away from dollars. They're going to gold, they're going to the yen, they're going to the Swiss franc. But it doesn't matter for Trump. I mean, yes, this is undermining US authority globally, it's undermining US power globally, but it is reinforcing, it is a byproduct of reinforcing his power domestically. So it is a scorched-earth strategy, and I think that we're probably going to see a lot of that in the next few years.
Not a happy note to end on. Out of respect for folks' time, we're past 7. There's still pizza left, so fill your pockets with pizza. You know, good grad students and undergrads. Yeah, of course. And then of course, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to our presenter, Arturo.
I just want to say something because I know that this has been taken, and people that follow the Cuba issue at times make big news, and I want to be sure that I make something clear. I say that I will not be surprised if the Cuban government face a major crisis or even collapse on that. But I want to make clear that I don't consider this the most likely scenario. And also to say that I will not be surprised if the Cuban government, hide during this time and survive the Trump administration. Is what I would say is that before it was very clear that in the absence of a US intervention, it was very clearly in a very likely scenario that the Cuban government was in control of everything. Now with these elements of how precarious is the situation, I introduce this possibility with more likelihood, but not the most likely scenario. I just want to make that clear because, you know, I am afraid that in a couple of years, someone can ask Aaron, you brought this alarmist student of yours to say things that it never happened and so that. And I would say it's not the most likely scenario. But now it must be counted.
Thank you for that, and thanks everybody for participating, especially to Francisco and Arturo. This is always a pleasure and I learn from them every time, so thanks so much.